chokwadi pasi pano taiona moto marongera vanoita wepanyika vanoda kuti isu vamwe tioneswe moto dai pasina kupindira kwaishe nechokwadi pasi pano taiona moto marongera vanoita wepanyika vanoda kuti isu vamwe tioneswe moto dai pasina kupindira kwaishe kana dzimba dzedu dzingadai dziri dzavo mawanzira vanoita dzimba dzavo vanoda kuti isu vamwe tigare.
America's just ended midterm elections drew a stark contrast between the Democrats and the Republicans. For the Democrats, it was a fight to save democracy and push out election result deniers, especially in Arizona, where Black Masters was running for Senate. Masters was part of the mob which stormed Capitol Hill on January 6, 2020, as losing Donald Trump tried to deny the election results. In Maricopa County in Arizona, the recorder Stephen Reicher, a Republican elected to run elections in Arizona, appeared to be agreeing with the Democrats on this one. The Republicans, on the other hand, said that it is time to defend the borders. The elections were tense. Let's hear Steve Reicher talk about how transparent are the American elections.
Oh, I think that's a 4-hour-long discussion, but I think that there are some who are committed, deeply committed, to the false notion that the 2020 election was stolen from President Trump, and I think that there are some who are unwilling to look at all the court cases, all of the reviews, all of the facts, all of the analyses that have been done, and agree that 2 + 2 = 4. And that's something that the board and I have said, this isn't a matter of partisanship, this is a matter of fact versus fiction, and we have to be on the side of fact because that's the responsible, ethical thing to do. It is disappointing. Regarding the allegation of who we hire, we have, like I said, close to 3,000 temporary workers for this November general election. Of all of those 3,000, the number of registered Republicans we have currently working for us and the number of registered Democrats we currently have working for us is within 5. So I think that's pretty darn good, if I may say so, and I am saying so. And so I think that it's without merit and it's disappointing. And we have had also observers from both political parties at all points in the process. And we've worked closely with the political parties, and we welcome that and we celebrate that. And so it's unfortunate, but the election was not stolen. The election system is safe and sound, and we will run an election that's valid, whether we like the winners or not. And I can tell you, I have voted for my fair share of losers, but as I like to say, they are not losers, they just lost an election.
The US has imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe, among other countries, over abuse of human rights and dodgy elections, which do not allegedly reflect the will of the people. During my time in the United States of America in North Carolina, I spoke to some top professors at the Duke University on these issues of democracy and sanctions, especially as American elections drew attention around issues to do with intimidation of voters, vote rigging, and also elections denying. This is the conversation I had with the professors. There's been a lot of talk about intimidation, voter intimidation, especially in Arizona, and also this election denial that the elections have been stolen.
Sure.
Now, in America's foreign policy, this is the type of things that it imposes sanctions, like it has imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe because of alleged voter fraud and free and fair elections. How do you feel? I mean, how does it feel for the Americans, rather, that they impose sanctions on other people for this kind of thing and they're doing it in their own home?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and I have to confess honestly that there's always been an element of hypocrisy to American promotion of democracy abroad, right? Because there have been many cases where we've made exceptions to that value to support authoritarian regimes that we perceive to support our interests. So that's nothing new. But for the last couple of decades at least, the United States has at least been able to point to the conduct of our own elections to say we remain whatever faults we may have, we remain one of the freest and fairest political systems in the world, and this is the standard that that we would hope that others aspire to. That has certainly been called into question in recent years as more and more states enact restrictive voting measures, and as one of our two major political parties, the Republican Party, has increasingly adopted anti-democratic or pro-authoritarian rhetoric as well as policies. I think we can take some measure of comfort from last night's election in that we did not witness on any large scale political violence. We did not witness on any large-scale voter intimidation or widespread suppression, and we have not yet witnessed on any large-scale losing candidates rejecting the outcome. But that's a pretty low bar, right? And I think the fact that we now have a significant portion of Americans who have lost faith in the election system is a huge problem in the long run, and that has implications for the health of our democracy, but it also has implications for the standards to which we try to hold other countries. So that's the best answer I can give to that.
It feels like there's a disjuncture, but I will say that disjuncture is an old one, right? I mentioned to you in an earlier conversation that I write about the American Civil Rights Movement. One of the great strategies of the American Civil Rights Movement in the era of decolonization was to point out to the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration after them that the rhetoric, in this Cold War moment when they were in a battle for the sort of loyalties or attention of decolonizing nations with the Soviet Union, it was for civil rights activists to point out to America that they were positioning themselves in the world as leaders of democracy when they did not have democratic practice at home, right? And so even the legislation, the Supreme Court decisions, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, which integrated schools and declared segregation unconstitutional, or the Voting Rights Act, or the Civil Rights Act. In some ways, those were as much about foreign policy as they were about domestic policy, because they needed to claim a legitimacy for American democracy that segregationist practices belied, right? And I will say that in that period, things were very, very violent. The attempt to get voting rights for African Americans involved white Southerners blowing up civil rights activists' homes, or lynching people who went to try to get people to the polls, or arresting people who registered to vote, saying that it was for one reason when they wrote it down, but then in the case of a woman in Mississippi telling her she had to be crazy if she thought she was going to vote, and then putting her in the state mental hospital for 2 months, right? So these things that we're worried about the violence, both extra-legal and state violence in contemporary elections are not new when you think about the experience of Black people in America, right? And Black activists have been very clear that America makes claims about itself on the world stage that its own history does not support. And so the ongoing project is always to make the U.S. align its practices with its ideals, or its own practices with its expectation for other people.
Yes, so this issue is a complicated one. The allegations of voter fraud is not necessarily proof of voter fraud. So coming out of the 2020 presidential election, where Donald Trump lost, many of his supporters, he and many of his supporters have alleged that there have been fraud in the election, improprieties. Those have been investigated, thoroughly, and there have been no evidence that there was fraud of a type that would have changed any election outcome. And so the kinds of fraud that the U.S. has criticized in other countries did not happen in the U.S. election in 2020, nor did it happen in the elections of last evening. So there's a disconnect between the allegation and what the reality is in terms of the fraud. Now, however, there are attempts in this country to limit the rights of people to exercise their right to vote in elections and suppress the vote. Now, this happens often through intimidation, by questioning someone's right to be at a polling site, questioning their citizenship rights, and often threatening criminal prosecution for them voting illegally. So there are efforts to be made, there are efforts that are made to limit the rights and opportunities of folks to vote. But it's not fraud on a broad scale that has been alleged by one party.
There is also this movement around the world of ensuring that there's gender equality and equity.
Right.
How is that in the United States?
It's kind of a heartbreaking question. The United States, again, ongoing project. We not only has the U.S. not met the goal of gender equality and gender equity, whether you're talking about pay or the burdens of childcare or bodily autonomy, but in some ways the U.S. is sliding backwards. I have a colleague, Jeremy Suri at the University of Texas, who makes an argument that if we wait for, that the U.S. has to operate in some ways with a little bit of hypocrisy, that the ideals have to be grand, even if the on-the-ground practice hasn't gotten there yet. Because if someone doesn't articulate the grand goals, then how do any of us reach them, right? And I have some sympathy for that, because again, one of the shocks of the Donald Trump presidency and Donald Trump's foreign policy were all of those moments when he would just say, I'm not going to pressure you guys to do the right thing because I don't feel like doing the right thing either, right? That's not good for America domestically, and it's not good for the sort of...
Oh, it's very hypocritical of the U.S. to go around the world and criticize elections that are run in other parts of the world and not pay attention to what's happening in this country, where there are attempts on a daily and yearly basis to limit voters' right to vote. And it's done by questioning folks' citizenship, putting roadblocks and impediments to vote, and requiring IDs that have never been required before, requiring IDs of a type that certain voters are less likely to have than others. So it's quite hypocritical of the U.S. To go abroad and criticize elections, but not reflect on our own shortcomings.
the world either.
So is America like a corrupt police officer?
I think America is like a police department where there is, now I'm turning it into like a 70s movie, but like where there are corrupt officers, but there are also kind of stand-up officers who are trying to reform the department. And they're always fighting an uphill battle because long-standing structures have power and undoing them is a slow slog. But their work matters and can have long-term effect.
But if the United States doesn't play that role in the world, do you think that it would be good for the world to not have that order?
No, I think it's one of the saddest things about the last 5 or 6 years in this country, and I think for the rest of the world, is that the U.S. has lost its ability to go to the rest of the world and to suggest and pressure countries to be more open in their democracies. Given what's happened in this country, we've gone backwards. It's hard for the U.S. to now to stand and make a claim and to criticize of the nations.
What then should the world do?
I hope the world will follow what I think is happening with the U.S. now, that we may be more on a road to a more normal America, moving back to before the Trump years came about, where there was general agreement that democracy was good, that participation was good, and if we continue to move back towards that direction, I think we'll once again will become a model for the rest of the world.
And lastly, you're an academic, a historian, and a woman of color for that matter. Did you find it difficult to get to the place where you are today?
To some extent, yes. I was born in the 1970s, which I think is a very different thing from having been a woman of color moving through academia, even born in the 1950s, or to some extent in the 1990s. I think that I am the post-civil rights generation in which Americans had a sort of broad consensus that integration was a worthy project and that you give some effort and investment to it. I benefited from being born into that generation. Folks who preceded me didn't have those kind of investments. They had to crack open doors and make places. The kids who are born now, in a moment when I'm fairly certain affirmative action, for example, in the US is going to end, also are born in a moment when many white Americans have gotten tired of the project of trying to make America fair. So they're going to have to do different work as well. So I had some struggles, but I could call upon popular conscience to help me in a way that I'm not sure would be as effective now.